In 1215, something happened in England. A group of nobles marched up to the king, armed, and demanded that he sign a document. That document was called the Magna Carta. Its core message was simple: the king cannot arrest people at will, cannot raise taxes without consent, and the property and rights of the nobility are to be protected. It should be noted that this document did not protect everyone. It protected those few who had the power to sit at the negotiating table. But even so, it established a precedent. Subjects could say no to royal authority within an institutional framework. Around the same era, in China's southern Qin Dynasty, there was a general named Yue Fei. He was the most capable military commander of his time, leading campaigns that recovered vast territories for the court. But the emperor considered him too great a threat. A single order summoned him back to the capital, and he was subsequently executed. Yue Fei did not resist. He accepted the imperial edict, returned, and was killed. In China's political structure, regardless of whether the emperor's decision was reasonable, there was no institutionalized way for a subject to express opposition. Why, in the same era, could subjects on one side of the world force their king to yield, while on the other side, a subject could only accept his death? To understand this difference, you first need to see how Europe's feudal system actually worked. In Europe, the relationship between a king and his nobles was not a simple chain of command. It was closer to a contract. The king granted land to the nobles. In return, the nobles pledged loyalty and military service. This contract was mutual. The king had an obligation to protect the nobles' interests, and the nobles had an obligation to serve the king. If the king violated the contract, seized a noble's land, imposed taxes without consultation, or infringed on traditional rights, the nobles had grounds to say, "You broke the rules first, so we have the right to withdraw our obedience." This was not rebellion. This was following the rules. The Magna Carta was the product of this logic taken to its extreme. And the key point is that Europe's nobles had the capital to resist. They had their own castles to defend, their own knights and armies, their own territories cultivated over generations, and their own sources of revenue. When the king needed to wage war, he relied on them for soldiers. When he needed money, he relied on them for taxes. Without these people, the king could accomplish nothing. So the king had no choice but to share power and sit down to negotiate. But this kind of legitimate resistance that also belonged only to nobles who possessed land and arms, ordinary peasants did not enjoy this right. It existed not because Europeans were braver, but because the power structure itself was decentralized. The king held only a portion of power. Another portion rested with the nobles. Neither side could swallow the other. Now look at China. Starting from the Qin Dynasty, China took a completely different path. The first emperor abolished the feudal system and replaced it with the county system. Local officials were appointed directly by the emperor, could not inherit their positions, and were rotated periodically. What did this mean? It meant that Chinese officials had no land of their own, no armies of their own, no castles to defend, no power base built up over generations. Everything they had, their position, their salary, their authority, came from the emperor's grant, and the emperor could take it back at any time. Their power had no independence. They had no institutional basis for opposing imperial authority. What could you possibly use to negotiate with the emperor? You had no soldiers, no land, no source of power independent of the throne. The only thing you possessed was the office the emperor gave you, and that office itself belonged to the emperor. So, in China's political tradition, any open defiance of the emperor had only one name: rebellion. No middle ground. No option called legitimate opposition. Either you obeyed, or you gambled your entire family's lives on overthrowing him. China was not entirely without attempts to constrain imperial power. Censors could remonstrate. The surveillance system could impeach. Confucian ethics could exert moral pressure. But all of these constraints shared one fundamental weakness. None of them possessed enforcement power, independent of the emperor himself. The emperor could listen, or he could ignore them. He could accept the advice, or he could execute the person who offered it. These were suggestions, not checks on power. The mechanism China actually used to deal with bad emperors was a different logic entirely. The mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven meant that the emperor's authority came from heaven's endorsement. If heaven chose you to rule, you were legitimate. But if you ruled too poorly, disasters piled up. The people suffered. That meant heaven had withdrawn its support, and the mandate had shifted to someone else. This sounds like a form of accountability, but it had one fundamental flaw. Who decided when the mandate had shifted? There was no court, no document, no procedure. The only standard was the outcome. If your rebellion succeeded, heaven was on your side, and you were the new legitimate emperor. If your rebellion failed, you were a traitor, and your entire family was executed. In Europe, legitimacy came from contract. In China, legitimacy came from outcome. China had a mechanism for replacing emperors, but it had no mechanism that could be enforced independently of imperial power to constrain them. You could not limit the emperor from within the system. You could only tear the entire system down and rebuild from scratch. This is why China went through dozens of dynastic changes across its history, but never produced a Magna Carta. Not because Chinese people didn't want one, but because the structure never grew the kind of power that could demand one. Both models came with a price. The decentralized model was slow and inefficient, frequently paralyzed by internal power struggles, but it had room for self-correction. When power went too far, it could be pulled back. The centralized model was fast and decisive, capable of concentrating resources on a massive scale, but it lacked space for internal correction. Once the top decision maker went wrong, the entire system followed until it collapsed and restarted. Neither was perfect. They were simply different ways of answering the same question. Should power be concentrated or dispersed? In 1215, English nobles forced the king to sit down and sign an agreement. Around the same era in China, Yue Fei proved with his life a single fact: in his world, there was no table to sit at. The Magna Carta has endured for 800 years, becoming one of the cornerstones of Western political civilization. Yue Fei's story has also endured for 800 years, becoming one of the deepest regrets in the Chinese heart. Two stories, two outcomes, but they point to the same question. When power is unchecked, what can the people within it do? One answer was to sit down and negotiate. The other was to endure until endurance was no longer possible, and then tear everything down and start over. That is why in Europe, resistance could become part of the negotiation, and in China, resistance could only become the beginning of a new dynasty.